Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, greetings all, and we're back again today talking about embodiment, integration, and self-love. For those of you who are on a journey of healing, a journey of self-discovery, a journey of self-realization, and for any curious minds who are exploring the intersection of psychology, spirituality, healing, trauma, and a return to their authentic self, then I welcome you. And again, if this is not your inquiry at this time, you're still welcome, because embodiment, integration, self-love is all about welcoming all that we are, all of who you are. And it is truly one of my favorite topics and a core focus of my practice and life, and I believe all of our lives ultimately. So let's step through these. Embodiment. What is embodiment? I think that each of these terms have perhaps their own meaning depending on the individual. Embodiment for me ultimately is to be all that you are as a human being. That is to say, all of your the fullness of who you are, integrating all the parts of your being, including your psyche, emotional freedom and acceptance, and being in your physical body, feeling your physical body, healing the parts of you that have been disconnected, dissociated, damaged, and to bring resolution to those narratives. Embodiment is also spiritual. Even if you may not have a particular belief system, or if you follow a religious or traditional path, or a secular path, however that may be, we have our unique journeys of self-discovery, of spiritual development and growth. Or if you don't use those terms, again, I would say self-discovery, self-actualization. And again, it is to bring the fullness of our psyche, our energies, our vitality, and ultimately our creativity. And there are many tools that can be used to become fully in embodiment. I like to use a wide variety of practices and different, I suppose we could say, modalities to deepen into, as we would call it, the human embodiment. For years, I've practiced meditation, which I highly recommend to those who feel a natural inclination towards that path. And breath work is highly recommended. Breath work is something that I'll be expanding on, as I've been doing a variety of breathing practices now for years. Although natural approaches are the most, I would say, highly recommended. That is to say, organic and natural practices that feel pleasing to you and that feel enjoyable and effective. And I have a little lizard on my left here that is crawling around. So shadow work as well is incredibly essential when we're talking about integration. And so that being said, I think I'll move on to integration talk. Mm, but to conclude that bit on embodiment, I would say that, and really they all interlink and overlap. Uh, Learning to love all the parts of yourself ultimately is how we fully embody. Learning to accept the parts of us that we don't perhaps fully comprehend, or that we feel ashamed of, or have been we've been conditioned to reject or to look down upon. So here I'll go into integration. Integration of the self ultimately means welcoming all the parts of you, all of the aspects of self, and coming to a profound and never-ending journey, really, of self-love, um, appreciation, respect, of being at home in your own body, being at home with your own company, being at home with, as is in modern times called, your inner family, your internal family. And here I'm going to have to mention one of the modern day authors and doctors on the subject of internal family systems, which is essentially parts therapy. And parts therapy is where we essentially work with speaking to the many parts of ourselves, and you'll have to excuse the airplane. Integration. So, integration. When I speak about integration, I am referring to a integration of all the parts of self, not only at the psychological level, but also physical, emotional, and beyond. We can say metaphysical, incorporating all aspects of the self that we ultimately are us. And returning to the core self, the core presence and essence that we are, the ever present knowing beingness that is essentially who we are. As sometimes when we refer to ourselves as I am, this conscious presence prior to any subpersonalities and parts. And my lizard friend is over here. Gecko. Okay. So, I have to mention one of the authors here that I've been studying for some time now. You may be familiar with Richard Schwartz, who has written a great deal on internal family systems model, and I highly recommend internal family systems. Here we have No Bad Parts for all our curious readers and minds. No Bad Parts emphasizes how essentially we want to welcome all parts of ourselves. And in terms of healing trauma and returning to wholeness within, a large part of this is learning to communicate and mediate with the various parts within ourselves that may have been perhaps fragmented or disconnected due to traumas. And what is interesting about this particular system by Richard Schwartz, he categorizes the parts into a couple core categories where there are essentially protectors, exiles, managers, and firefighters. And these parts serve a purpose within our internal family. The protectors naturally protect the system, and they seek to protect the exiles, which are oftentimes the fragmented parts within, often the most vulnerable, and carry oftentimes an emotional narrative, often the trauma identities that are being protected by these protectors. And then we have the managers, which can sometimes be referred to as like our adult selves or our adult parts, those parts that tend to kind of carry the day-to-day management tasks and tend to be what would be in modern times referred to as the adulting selves, although they don't have an age necessarily. And then there is the firefighters, which are parts of our system that are kind of like the emergency response. So in extreme cases, they will be act out, if, again, for the purpose of protecting the psyche or the self or the exiles. The firefighters, of course, would be extremes and can oftentimes be considered unhealthy coping mechanisms, even self-destructive and damaging to the human being. Now, communicating with all of these parts is a delicate process, and it's one that we can work on independently, although it benefits us to work with someone who can essentially abide within their core self without being affected by the various parts. And I'd like to mention briefly here, because Richard Schwartz actually opens up in his first chapter, We Are All Multiple, where he emphasizes that we're all raised in what he refers to as monomind belief system, the idea that you have one mind out of which different thoughts and emotions and impulses and urges emanate. And this is not suggesting multiple personality disorders, which nowadays is dissociative identity disorders. But again, this is to understand that we actually have parts of our system, and sometimes these parts can actually be categorized even as emotional parts. And so, hello. Okay, my friend over here is enjoying the talk. Okay, so I wanted to mention that, and for those of you who are on a spiritual path of awakening, of integrating and abiding in consciousness, prior to thoughts, emotions, and sensations as the awareness, which may not be relevant for everyone. Doing parts therapy and acknowledging traumatized identities and healing trauma without dismissing the trauma or the stories and the emotions is very important. I think a lot of times in these sometimes spiritual schools and belief systems, it can be easy to dismiss and to not give the appropriate care, compassion, and integration to welcome and accept and bring home these parts of our system, which are essential ultimately. And I think the ego often gets a bad rap in these schools. Ultimately, the goal should be ego integration, a healthy ego integration, and not an absolute destruction of the ego, which can actually be would ultimately be dysfunctional as a human being. Of course, I will acknowledge that it is definitely possible to exist in, we can call them expanded states of consciousness, blissful states of consciousness, and to expand awareness beyond the typical classically understood model of sensory perception. But for our sake here and our context, we are looking to embody as a human being, which we are already, and to integrate all these parts of ourselves. And as I mentioned earlier, a huge part of this is self-love. Self-love, which perhaps may be the ultimate purpose and perhaps the greatest challenge for all of us. Self-love, I would say, ultimately is the path and the reason why we're here. When we truly love ourselves, when we truly are applying self-love, this is the way that we create safety in our system, that we bring home all of the parts of ourselves, all of ourselves. And this is the way that we return to what I would refer to as the eternal self, the core self, the timeless being that you are, the ever-present consciousness and essence that you are. And this essence, this authentic being, is healing, is naturally healing. It is this which ultimately heals, I believe. And as a healer, and anybody that heals knows that ultimately we can only facilitate, but we cannot directly heal. For one is ready and open to receive and return home to themselves. There is a natural healing process that occurs, and it is, in a way, it is mysterious in that it cannot be contrived or forced. It is organic, it is flowing, it is fluid, and it is natural. Self-love, again, can be an emotional process. It can stir up some of these protective parts that perhaps are securing the inner exiles, which may be overwhelmed and highly vulnerable due to a traumatic experience in the past. And as is commonly known nowadays, trauma memory is often stored in, it is commonly known, increasingly known, that it is stored in the body, right? As now well-known book, Body Keeps the Score, presents that our cells and our lymphatic even cellular memory stores these painful experiences. And so we seek to bring love and compassion and kindness and a gentle release of these painful imprints. There are always accelerated and more direct methods, if that be your choosing and proclivity, but I think the majority of us, there is a natural, more, we can say, graceful process to restore oneself. Now, in the journey of self-love, so something that I thought I'd mention as well is self-compassion and self-forgiveness. Many of us, I believe, have been conditioned, we have received conditioning and programming that oftentimes leads us to perhaps be our own harshest critic and judge. Now, yes, psychologically, we all have a superego, which is that part of us that establishes the heightened forces, I would say, even a greatest level of inner criticism and judgment. And this is a built-in natural function of our psyche. Uh, it's not something that can be removed or needs to be. Um, but bringing to counterbalance this function, I think self-compassion and self-forgiveness and a gradual awareness, increasing self-awareness of our inner conditioning and programming can be extremely beneficial to create inner balance and equanimity and ultimately self-love. To see that, as I like to say, ultimately at your deepest, your most essential self, who you are as a whole is beautiful, lovable, is enough, is whole, is essentially nothing. I like to say, nothing wrong with you. And this may be difficult to perhaps say to yourself. I still struggle myself as well. I'm still applying and working through my own journey of self-compassion and self-forgiveness. And we're all in this together. This is a collective journey as well as an individual journey. And I thought I'd mention very quickly here, on a slightly separate topic, neurodivergence. Because many of you, and I myself being self-identifying as on the spectrum of neurodivergence, wanted to mention this topic, as it seems that there's an increasing number of folks out here in the community and in our world, and it seems that the technologies, artificial intelligence, the accelerated pace of our world is perhaps wiring us to perhaps even develop a nervous system that is increasingly neurodivergent, breaking away from the neurotypical. I would add that planetary changes, frequency shifts, and even we can call multidimensional changes are also changing us to be closer to what would be considered within the neurodivergent spectrum. Now, the reason why I mention this is because one of the classic items to address, say, within someone with neurodivergence is oftentimes what is known as masking. And so much of the journey of a person with neurodivergence, for example, involves being compassionate with oneself, first and foremost. Self-compassion. Because there is definitely a higher likelihood to be criticized and judged negatively, and to feel greater shame for being oneself, which leads to just a very negative self-image. So self-compassion and self-acceptance, ultimately, and acceptance to me is such a profound thing. Acceptance, I think, is to me the core of self-love, in fact. when we can accept what is, when we can accept ourselves as we are, with all of our parts, our stories, our experiences, and our dreams, visions, and unusual experiences, inexplicable, anomalous experiences. When we can bring all of this home as perfectly acceptable, and we can discuss and we can see ourselves and hear ourselves and be present with ourselves, this helps us to increasingly become all that we are, which brings us back to embodiment. And maybe this is a circle or a cycle that we are working through. But yes, approaching ourselves with self-compassion that is non-judgment, empathy, and understanding is, I believe, what we all seek from one another. But to give ourselves that gift, I believe, is ultimately what we are seeking. And it is also perhaps the greatest challenge, to give ourselves that deep love and understanding, to provide that for our many parts, those exhausted protectors perhaps have been too busy, those busy managers, these overwhelmed and abandoned children, inner child parts that want our care and our attention and love, and to know that they're not alone. When we can become our own inner fortitude, then this is freedom. This return to our authentic being is freedom. And as we do so, creative power is unleashed. We may even expand beyond our ordinary sense of perception and see that perhaps we are indeed something, someone far greater than anyone ever taught us, than any teacher, parent, religious institution, or social institution, or any social programming, any films, that perhaps indeed who we are is far more than we've ever been told. And I'm here to say that if you are a living, essence, a spark of creation, then without a doubt you are. So you are worthy of your own healing. You are worthy of the return to your original true self. And all of you is welcome. So, with that, I leave you and I say thank you for listening to this discussion, this talk on embodiment, integration, and self-love. Topics that we'll continue to expand on and work through, and ultimately live day to day, each in our own way. So thank you so much. Much love, honor, gratitude. Thank you for being here with me. Until next time, be safe. Welcome home, all of you.